Hi everyone, welcome to my guest lecture today. I hope that you're all doing well wherever you may be. I think that I have a really fun lecture for you today. It is packed with information though, so I will have this video recording and I will also have the PowerPoint with my notes that I'll give to Kelly to upload. So today I will be lecturing on games, culture, and representation. So, go over this a little bit. What we're going to do for today. We are going to first talk about important moments in game studies. Then we're going to talk about tensions in digital games. Then we're going to hit race, gender, and LGBT plus representation in games. We'll talk about increasing player representation. And then finally, we'll talk about the growing role of the audience. So like I said, a lot of things that we're hitting today. Usually I do this lecture very interactively, but luckily because I am your TA, I'll be able to incorporate things from the lecture in our discussion posts. And feel free to ask me any questions in those discussions about this lecture that you would like. So let's start with important moments in game studies. The first thing that we really need to talk about is Johan Huizinga. He is a Dutch man, and in 1938 he basically started game studies by writing a book called Homo Ludens, and this means man the player. So what Huizinga was talking about in that book is that play is part of the sacred sphere. It is an essential aspect of culture, and it is spiritual. It's on the same level as religion for him. Another important concept that he came up with was that of the magic circle. And to explain the magic circle, I'll use a more contemporary example where you and a bunch of friends sit down to a game of, let's say, Monopoly. And there are certain rules that are held in Monopoly that don't make sense in the real world, right? Like if you step into your roommate's room, you don't suddenly owe them $200, yeah? But if you land on your competitor's property in Monopoly, you owe them money. So the magic circle then is a space within a culture that is kind of a theoretical space. And if you heard that, sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and turn off desktop audio. It's a theoretical space where there are additional rules or understandings of how to interact that may not be consistent with regular society. But once you sit down at that table, you get on the playing field, you agree to be part of this play. So hopefully that makes sense of what the magic circle is. It is a semi-permeable barrier that doesn't really exist, but is a theoretical concept to explain how people agree to certain rules and forms of play. So our next big researcher then comes along in 1961. This is Roger Caillois, and he is French, which means I am probably pronouncing that last name wrong. Bear with me, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. I am not great at French. So in 1961, Caillois released Man, Play, and Games. And basically he was expanding on these concepts from Huizinga. He also really liked Greek and Latin terms, so his terms for things go back to that a lot. So the first is he came up with the concept that there are two types of play. These two types are Ludens and Paideia. Ludens, as we know from Huizinga, is man the player. For Cowboy, Ludens means structured play. So this is the play that has rules to it. It's when you sit down to Monopoly and you read out the rules and you say, okay, those are the rules, that's what we're going to play by. Paideia is more freeform play. So, excuse me, recording late. Paideia freeform play might be when someone decides to poke you or have a tickle fight, or just like an outspring of tag starts without any set rules, or when kids will play a game and they'll make up rules as they go. That's more Paideia. Then he also came up with 4 play forms. So play can be on a scale from highly structured Ludens to completely freeform, no rules Paideia. That is a range, not an either or. And then there are 4 play forms that can coexist, but these are the main forms he saw of what play is. And he called them Agon, Alea, Mimesis, and Ilinx. So let's go into these in a little bit more detail here. The first is Agon, and Agon meant competition. So when you're playing a sport and you're playing against someone, if you're playing chess, you're against someone. It is this realm of competitive play. It's not that you're playing together, you're in opposition. And this can also mean more current games where the humans are playing together against the game. You are still trying to win and not lose. The next is Alea. This means chance. So you can think about this as the roll of the dice. Gambling games are very strongly within Alea. But we also see these elements in tabletop games of competition. Like in Monopoly, you need to roll the dice to figure out where you land. The third is mimesis. This is mimicry. So I've included an image of a mime as kind of the thing that you can solidify in your head. They will copy the actions of people going down the street in order to get laughs, but this might also be your sibling going, I'm not copying you, and copying everything you say, right? It might be super annoying for you, but it's entertaining and fun for them, and it's a form of play. The final is Ilinx, and this is a physical rush. This is a sensation play. So, you might have, say, a roller coaster. When you feel your stomach drop, your arms get really weird, you have a rush of sensations happening during a roller coaster ride. And that's fun for many people. You might also consider when kids have some kind of turny, rolly chair thing and they spin really, really fast until they're dizzy. Or piñatas, when you blindfold someone, spin them before they hit the piñata, before they pin the tail on the donkey. This is all Ilinx and creating a physical sensation as part of play. So we'll go back to this slide. We've gone over Johann Huizinga, who started game studies, Roger Calloy, who is kind of the next major moment, who really breaks down forms of play, as well as types of play. And then our third moment that we're going to talk about is Adrienne Shaw in 2010. And she came out with an article called What is Video Game Culture? Now, important here is that a lot of game studies prior to Shaw's work considered games as culture. We would say like gamers, They were their own pocket niche groups, and we would focus on what happens in a game or what happens with those gamers as forms of culture. Shaw argues, though, that we should consider games in culture. So rather than separate from, they are part of. So games are now not their own separate thing to study. What we should look at with games is what they say, what the practices and behaviors in them say about the society in which they occur. So obviously we can have some tensions then. One, there's a tension between considering games as culture and considering games in culture, but there are also tensions that are brought up by those who consider games as culture. The first I want to talk about relates to an article by Christopher A. Paul, and you don't have to worry too much about all the names of the people that are involved with these things other than the important moments, but I wanted to provide the names and the names of articles in case you are interested in game studies and want to follow up with this information. So Christopher A. Paul came out with an article on toxic meritocracy. So we know that a meritocracy basically means that the harder you work, the more effort you put in, the more reward you get, and the higher you are in society. This seems good, but a toxic meritocracy takes the flip of that, where if you are not high in society, therefore it is your fault, not anything related to systemic issues or other variables. It is your fault for not putting in the effort. And therefore, you can be harassed, bullied, whatever the case may be. We might see this in games with someone who has been playing a multiplayer online game for a long time. They're extremely high level, and they choose to just kill level 1 players. They could feel justified because these are new players in their space. They've put in a lot of work, right? But what that does is it disenfranchises new players to the group. They may not want to play if every time they try, they're killed, right? The second is this hardcore versus casual tension. So, when you think of a hardcore gamer, you might think of the image that is up on this screen. It may be an overweight, unkempt, not great hygiene, someone with a messy apartment who spends all their time playing games, getting good at games. The big thing here is that there are certain games that hardcore players consider important. They're the games that take time to get good at, that have rankings. So think about like Halo, Call of Duty, League of Legends. These are all games that hardcore players may consider part of their realm and real games. And this is against casual players, which sometimes you might hear the term filthy casual, right? And this may be people who play mobile games, who play cutesy games, who play handhelds versus console or PC. There's a whole lot that goes into it. But there is this tension in the industry, basically, between hardcore and casuals. And hardcore gamers consider the explosion of like mobile games, Facebook games, Zynga, all of that stuff to be a detriment to game industry because it increases the number of casual gamers. The final thing that I just want to touch on really quickly within the tensions is Gamergate. As we did the midterm, I realized that a lot of you weren't actually familiar with Gamergate, which I think is great. But this was a huge explosion, basically, a while back. Just real quick, Zoe Quinn had a game about depression. It was getting a lot of flack. Then she had some issues with someone she broke up with, and they went on the internet and accused her basically of sleeping with someone to get good reviews for her game. And this then exploded into Gamergate, which theoretically said that it was interested in ethics in games and games journalism and having reviews be true to form. In practice, they doxed Zoe Quinn and many other women in games and academics who study games as well. They would find information like their home phone number, their family's number, their addresses. They would call them up, threaten them, threaten to kill them, talk about sexual things they would do to them. So in practice, this was really more against people who don't fit the stereotypical gamer archetype not being allowed in games, and people trying to gatekeep them out of it using horrible harassment. As a note, where Zoe Quinn lived did have cyber harassment laws, and though it took a long time, I have a piece that I've written actually about all of the problems that Zoe Quinn faced with this. Eventually, the judge did rule in her favor against the Gamergaters and her ex-boyfriend for their harassment. So that's just a very quick overview of that. And so since we're talking about this tension around Gamergate, which really had to do with gender and race and LGBT people in games, let's talk about that and the representations that we see. So Shira Chess in 2017 came out with this book called Ready Player 2, which was based off of the popular Ready Player 1. Some of you may have seen the more recent movie of that, where she talked about Player 1 and Player 2 as archetypes in games. So Player 1 is this young, white, able-bodied, and affluent male. So he's a upper middle class to high class socioeconomic status. He has the money, the time, and the resources to spend on playing games. Player 2, however, are those not included in Player 1, but it's really an emphasis on women and this Jennifer archetype. Basically, one of the game companies that Chess spoke to had this image of a middle-aged white woman from the Midwest named Jennifer, who they considered the market for their more casual mobile games. So this gives you an idea that Player 1, yes, is a stereotype of this young white able-bodied, etc. Player 2 in general follows an archetype rather than a group. So it's not like all women of a certain age, it's this archetype of this specific Midwest woman. So pay attention to that. But one of the things that I wonder here is who's left out of the discussion. While we say that Player 1 is able-bodied, we don't see that full discussion about Player 2 articulated, and what Chess is trying to get at is who is left out. Her focus really is on a female-male binary there that doesn't really consider non-binary who are left out, disabled bodies who are left out, etc., etc. So then Shaw, before coming out with the games as versus in culture in 2010, had an article in 2009 called Putting the Gay in Games. And what Shaw found out from this was that game companies were worried about adding LGBT representation and being labeled as the game. So this was not games like Dream Daddy, where like the gay element of the dads was central. These were regular games that didn't want to add LGBT representation because they thought that that would then put them in the same category as a game like Dream Daddy, which I think is ridiculous, but those are the arguments that Shaw saw in the article. I do want to note that gay characters in games aren't exactly a new thing. We had the first gay homosexual man in 1985 murder mystery game from France. However, this was a non-playable character, and spoiler alert, he was the murderer, so not exactly great representation. And 1992, we had the first playable, potentially gay character. You could play as a boy or girl, and then at one point in the game, you have to choose whether to seduce the brother or sister. So, in theory, whether you were a male or a female player, you could be bisexual, homosexual, heterosexual, whichever way you played the game. However, in practice, this wasn't about representation. It was just easier to code. They wanted to include options of what the player could be gender-wise at the start, but at the time in 1992, they didn't exactly have the bandwidth or the resources. But they didn't really have the bandwidth to include code for changing those options. So it was just easier to leave the code the same, no matter which one you chose at the beginning. So if those are the representations that we've had in the past in games, and luckily we are seeing improvements as we go, let's talk about increasing player representation. So we can talk about the role of the game creators, and this relates to the first of your readings that you had, which was Amanda C. Coates' 2018 article. And to give brief overview of this, what Coate discovered was that game moderation is most successful with community involvement. So she studied several game companies, how they reacted to harassment and things in their games, and looked at the success rates of those reactions. And Riot Games, which is the producer of League of Legends, League of Legends has been well known as a hotbed of harassment and bad player behavior for a long time. It became kind of a stereotype. But Riot Games saw an improvement in their community, and about 80% of the time, the community agreed with Riot Games' assessment of bad behavior on League of Legends. So what they would do is they wouldn't just unilaterally put down a decision. They would post on community boards saying, this is the scenario, this is what we think should happen, and they got community feedback on that. So we see that when game creators involve their communities, we have better success at reducing harassment, which increases player representation. The other article that you had to read relates to the role of the players in increasing player representation. So you had Kashana L. Gray's 2012 article talking about Xbox Live and her experiences on there, as well as 3 communities, basically, of women and how they reacted to the harassment that they saw. So, in short, Gray talked about Black and Latina and LGBT Latina women and the 3 ways they reduced harassment they experienced on Xbox Live. And so that might be Gray's group, which would basically only play with their group. And that way they weren't interacting with people who would harass them because of their gender or their race. She spoke with a group of lesbian Puerto Rican women, and there was this sense of community there, of pride with their group, but also this sense of not dealing with any bullshit, right? And then the third group was a group who decided that they needed to be better than the men because they would still be harassed, but now it wasn't for being bad, it was for being better. So they put the onus on themselves to change the form of harassment that they endured. And then I want to talk about Twitch and performing identity for the role of the players. Many of you may know that Twitch is a live stream gaming platform. I participate a lot on Twitch. Actually, this setup I have right now is pretty much my standard Twitch setup. Different things I'll change depending on the day and what I'm streaming. But this recording is done like my Twitch streams. And there are multiple stories, multiple articles that deal with these stories about people personifying an identity, performing their identity on Twitch. So one example is James Charles, and I assume many of you are familiar with James Charles, but just really quick, he is a YouTube beauty guru who, quite famous, has a lot of subscribers, and he streams on Twitch and is very clear about his identity. He's well known for being gay. He says he is gaming, Gayming, when he plays on Twitch. He also calls out typical trolling behavior as homophobia. So he further draws attention then to himself as a gay man. There are also anecdotes of a black man who loves opera putting on hip-hop in the background of his streams because it is what his audience expects, and when he has opera, they are surprised. So in some cases, it can be a true identity, like James Charles, but often it is hyper identity and hyper performed. So there's this back and forth of, one, the onus is on the streamer to perform their identity, and two, what does that performance actually mean? And since we're talking about Twitch, I think it's important to bring up the growing role of the audience. So you're not necessarily, though these things still happen, playing a game just for yourself. Many people, many more every day, are streaming their games on Twitch. And these games range from digital PC games, Xbox, PlayStation, whatever the case may be there. People have capture cards put on their handheld devices so that you can play along with like Pokemon or something. And even tabletop games can be played on Twitch. And Twitch really privileges the audience in their About section. So this is the front of the About page for Twitch, and it says, "We saved you a seat in chat." Now you notice this isn't about the streamers. This isn't about the game industry. This is about the people who are watching streamers play games. That is the privileged audience here. So with things like Twitch and esports and the rise of adequate mobile gaming, 5G, for example, for more intensive mobile play, we need to pay attention to the growing role of the audience, not just the player and the game creator, in shaping and transforming game culture. And that also relates to what my thesis is about, so if you want me to talk way too much about that, I can give you a lot of information there. But in short, that's basically what we're looking at here for this lecture. I probably talked a little quickly, but so let's go over some key takeaways. The first thing that I want you to take away from this is Huizinga and Calloy's work establishing game studies. And in particular, Huizinga's concept of the magic circle and Cowboy's 4 play forms: Aegon, Alia, Mimesis, and Ilinx. I also want you to consider representation in games and in players. This relates to your readings, and think about who games are for and how do you know. I want you to think about Twitch and changing game perspectives. As said, Twitch's focus is really on the audience. More and more games are coming out that have an audience feature. Think Jackbox TV, where you may not play yourself, but you can be part of an audience and vote on things. So think about this changing perspective of who games are for and what that says then about the games industry and games in culture. And given that games in culture, this is going to be kind of a central question for our discussion this week, and that is, should we study games as or as part of culture? AKA Shaw's distinction between games as culture versus games in culture. And just really quick, if you aren't interested in taking more courses about games, UW-Madison has 4 that I know of. Be aware that game theory and game studies are completely separate things. So if you're interested in game studies and things around game studies, CA 547 is Digital Game Cultures. That's taught by Derek Johnson. Curriculum 357 is Game Design 1. Curriculum 432 is Game Design 2. And in this course, you make your own game. So Game Design 1 basically sets up some more information about game studies and how people go about creating games. And Game Design 2, you put that into practice. And then Art 563 is Graphic Design for Games. All of these last 3 are going to be offered next fall. And if you do know of any other game studies courses on campus, please let me know so that I can add them to my list. Other than that, that's the end of my lecture for you all today. I want to thank you so much for allowing me to do this lecture, even with our changed format. And I really hope that wherever you are safe, you are well, and that you're making it through this very odd time that we're going through. All right, so that's everything. And other than that, I will see you in discussion this week. Bye, y'all.